Hello, my name is Elaine Ewart, Visiting Fellow at the University of Essex. My paper today is called Breaching the Borders, an Archipelagic Approach to Environmental Writing. At a time of political fragmentation in the United Kingdom, in the fallout produced by Brexit, in this paper I examine the British crisis of national identity through the lens of archipelagic theory, an emergent movement in ecocriticism. I then apply archipelagic theory to three examples of women's environmental writing recently published in the UK. Amy Liptrot's The Outrun, Eluned Gramich's The Woman Who Brings the Rain, and Melissa Harrison's All Among the Barley. What do cultural concepts of islands and islandness have to tell us about our relationship to place as it appears in the literary productions of these islands and elsewhere? What is archipelagic theory? What does it mean to think in an archipelagic way? The word archipelago can refer to a group of islands or the sea containing them. Originally, it referred specifically to the Aegean Sea between Greece and Asia Minor. Yet borders of an archipelago can be shifting and indeterminate, an arbitrary configuration in terms of what is included within its boundaries, and what subjective patterns of earth and water we decide forms part of its identity. Archipelagic theory, as it relates to ecocriticism, takes account of two related approaches. The first is the use of the concept as a lens through which to view the literature of the British Isles, or other archipelagic regions of the world. The second, related to the first, explores the term as a description of place-based writing which is concerned with devolution and connection. Philip Schweitzer and Simon Mealer introduce an exposition of the first approach under the title Archipelagic Identities, Literature and Identity in the Atlantic Archipelago, 1550 to 1800, published in 2004, a series of essays in comparative literature which examined the interrelatedness of the nations of these islands and the way in which notions of Britishness and Englishness have been constructed. 4 years later, John Kerrigan, in Archipelagic English, Literature, History and Politics, 1603 to 1707, notes the increasing use by historians of the term archipelago to describe early modern England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales as politically and culturally linked and divided, and shows how this archipelagic perspective can also be applied to its literature. Kerrigan's monograph is situated in the cultural redrawing of maps in the British Isles in the aftermath of the devolution process. He anticipates the current political disruption by raising the question of whether, in response to devolution in its various forms in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, England will assert its own national identity. He argues, quote, "Devolution matters because it has encouraged the peoples of the islands to imagine different relationships with one another and with the peoples of Europe, the future of the European Union providing one horizon, but also because of the opportunity it gives the Anglophone world as a whole to reconfigure its understanding of where it comes from." End quote. Reading these lines now, in the throes of the outplaying of the UK referendum result on membership of the European Union, it encourages an archipelagic perspective on the Brexit crisis. This archipelagic approach to literature written in a particular geographical area is developed by John Brannigan in Archipelagic Modernism, Literature in the Irish and British Isles, 1890 to 1970, published in 2015. Using as examples writers such as Woolf, Joyce, Yeats and Hardy, he examines the way in which modernist literature interrogates the imperial/unionist homogeneity of the British Isles and critiques the centrality of the urban within traditional modernist literary criticism. He notes the difficulty of naming the islands of the British archipelago in a devolutionary way, and that, just as previously, the periphery has been absorbed by the centre as part of building up the British power base, the reverse happens when the power base declines. Brannigan also points out the anomalous position of England within the British archipelago. As observed by the constitutional lawyer Vernon Bogdanor, quote, "Constitutionally, England does not exist." End quote. Brannigan summarises England's identity crisis as connected to an illusion of the nation with the archipelago. Quote, England, it seems, remains securely wedded to a British and imperial identity which steadily ceased to exist in the course of the 20th century, and does so because the alternative is to think of itself as one peripheral nation among others, or perhaps not even a nation at all. End quote. I now move on to the second use of the word archipelagic. This is as an alternative term to describe nature writing, suggested by Joss Smith. Contemporary writing about human relationships with place by British writers such as Richard Mabey, Robert Macfarlane and Kathleen Jamie have been designated by critics as the new nature writing. Smith argues that such texts could more helpfully be described as an archipelagic literature. He outlines some of the problems with the term nature writing as a description of such texts, including the way in which it reinforces a separation of nature from human culture and history. Smith is also alert to the potentially reactionary emphasis on place-based descriptions, which depict an unproblematic and fixed geographical identity. He suggests the term archipelagic as an alternative designation for progressive place writing that resists top-down bio-colonial centralisation. The term archipelagic, Smith contends, is concerned with ebbs and flows of devolution and connection, and the instability of meanings ascribed to place. Archipelagos connect an intimate concern with the local to a global network. Both Brannigan and Smith describe the connotations of the adjective archipelagic in ways which go beyond the description of physical island groups. For Brannigan, archipelagic modernism is, quote, a border literature which finds resonances, pluralities, unlikely alliances and shared spaces, and seeks out new ways of belonging, new ways of exploring a politics of common welfare, end quote. While Smith considers that the, quote, spatial metaphor of the archipelago, with its fluid and neutral polycentrism, is a very useful way of thinking about place as progressive, end quote. I turn now to recent examples of place-based writing, which examine archipelagic environments, or whose concerns could be considered archipelagic by the criteria discussed above. Amy Liptrot's The Outrun, published in 2016, a memoir which describes the author's struggle with alcoholism and the role of the Orkney archipelago in helping her stay dry following rehab in London, has a prose style which is gritty, direct and sensual. Liptrot deals boldly with the imagery of landscape, making the features of the Orcadian environment, weather and geology into metaphors for her own struggles and attempt to make sense of her identity. There is an undercurrent running through the book of the way globalization and the ubiquity of digital culture problematize our experience of place. The text vacillates geographically between London and Orkney, just as the author describes her struggles with the competing attractions represented to her by these two contrasting environments. London, the place in which she has located her hopes for an exciting, vibrant future, becomes, as she descends into the destructive spiral of alcoholism, a site of disillusionment and isolation, a kind of non-place in which she is lost in both space and time through her drinking binges. In contrast, Orkney, her childhood home that she had previously hoped to escape, is where she learns how to inhabit her own consciousness and appreciate the sensual immediacy of her physical environment. The Outrun is radically archipelagic, not only in its island setting, but in the subtle way it handles movement between the cultural periphery and the centre. In the chapter London Fields, Liptrot juxtaposes a description of her isolation in a series of anonymous London flats with a section about the legendary vanishing island of Orkney, Heather Blether. She explains that by crossing to mainland Britain from Orkney, she had crossed, quote, a boundary not just of sea, but also of imagination, because I came from an island. London was the fantasy, and London Fields was my Heather Blether, end quote. London, perceived as the cultural centre, becomes as elusive as the mythical island. Returning to returning sober to Orkney after rehab. Liptrot further challenges the location of the centre by her descriptions of staying on the outlying islands of Orkney, in relation to which the mainland means mainland Orkney. In his review of Liptrot's book in The Guardian in 2016, Will Self identifies the fluid construction of the narrator's occupation of physical space. Lying in her bed in a cottage on the tiny island of Pape, she mentally maps onto the island the outline of the London borough of Hackney, where she lived during the years of her problem drinking. Self also notes the role technology plays in Liptrot's sense of identity. In a life of numerous physical removes, she considers the internet to be her home, while recognising the addictive qualities of attachment to this other non-place, where satisfaction is infinitely deferred. Yet Liptrot eschews the easy disparagement of the digital world, instead writing about the ways in which technology shapes our experience of our environment, such as her use of Google Maps on her mobile phone to help her track corncrakes at night during her temporary conservation job. Eluned Gramich's Woman Who Brings the Rain, a memoir of Hokkaido, Japan, published in 2015, is less dramatically confessional than Liptrot. Welsh-born Gramich's account of her visit to Japan, living with a Japanese couple, charts with sure-footed delicacy her attraction to and alienation from life in an unfamiliar culture. As discussed above, archipelagic approaches involve a cultural decentering, bringing a new perspective to our assessment of places designated as remote or peripheral. Gramich is finely sensitive to the languages associated with the mountain in whose shadow she is staying, called Yotei in Japanese and Makori Napori in Ainu, the language of the indigenous people of the island. Gramich interprets and explores the different relationships of the two languages to the mountain and the island of Hokkaido. In terms of Japanese culture, Hokkaido, colonized by the Japanese in the 1860s, who changed or supplanted the original Ainu place names, is on the periphery, quote, defined in relation to the mainland, as if it were but a pale imitation of the true centre of culture, which resides in the capitals, Kyoto and Tokyo, hundreds of miles in the west. End quote. Gramich sees this peripheral perception reflected in the Japanese name of the Japanese name of the mountain, Yotei, meaning sheep's hoof, an appellation which, quote, implies a quick survey of the area without having explored its slopes, end quote. She points out that a sheep's hoof, like a human fingernail, can be cut away. Quote, the hoof, then, is an expression of liminality dangerously close to becoming detached, inanimate, a foreign body, end quote. In contrast, the Ainu name, Makari Napori, quote, doesn't contain any notions of centre or periphery. These concepts don't enter into a language where there was no word even for Hokkaido, the island, end quote. The Ainu consider their island so much a part of their existence that there is no separate word for it. Makari Napori, meaning mountain surrounded by a river, contains the image of a circle, an image of wholeness, of inclusion. This unearthing and reconstructing of former cultures and relationships to place are a feature of what I consider as a distinctly archipelagic approach. Finally, Harrison's novel, All Among the Barley, published in 2018, is an example of English women's nature writing, but anomalous in terms of the other two examples I have chosen. It is a historical novel, not a memoir. Set in 1933, its setting is rural, but not coastal England. The novel is a Bildungsroman, describing the tragic coming of age of first-person narrator Edie, whose family have farmed the land for generations, but whose way of life is threatened by the social, political and technological changes following the First World War. We see the beauty of a richly biodiverse environment, chiefly through home-loving Edie's descriptions, characterised by the attention to organic detail appropriate to a narrator whose lifestyle is dictated by the seasonal rhythms of local, non-human life. and the fervent interest of urban newcomer Constance in a declining way of life is initially the object of mockery by the villagers, until the darker side of her fascination with rural life becomes clear. Harrison displays an archipelagic interest in subverting ideas of margins and centres, shown in the contradictory attitudes her characters hold towards the urban-rural polarity. Edie is both drawn to and frightened by the unknown excitement of London life represented by Constance. And while Constance's fascist propaganda provocatively presents the countryside as, quote, the heart of our nation and the repository of our national pride, she encourages Edie to come back to London with her and escape the narrow range of possible futures open to her in the small, struggling farming community in which she has grown up. As Greg Garrard notes, the novel, quote, both validates environmental nostalgia and critiques the ethno-nationalistic nostalgia with which it is too easily conflated, end quote. Although, as I have said, Harrison's book is somewhat anomalous in terms of the other literary examples I've selected, its importance in this context lies in its direct treatment of the connection between rural nostalgia and dangerous forms of English nationalism. In his article, Brexit Ecocriticism, Greg Garrard notes the importance for Leave voters of a rural English nationalism and, quote, imperial nostalgia rooted in landscape aesthetics, end quote. Nature writer and critic Richard Smith's article, Nature Writing's Fascist Roots, examines the way in which certain strands of the English nature writing tradition has been accompanied by a distaste for modernity and humanity in general, which leaves it vulnerable to fascist appropriation. Harrison's All Among the Barley is an example of a new alertness within English nature writing of the ways in which idealised representations of rural Englishness can be and have been used to support extreme right-wing ideologies. So, in conclusion, recently, the separate identities and politics of the devolved nations of the UK have come to prominence over Brexit and, to some extent, COVID. Greg Garrard considers that at the core of Brexit eco-criticism is, quote, the 5 discrete nationalisms of the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and their relationship to environmental representations, end quote. And through the examples I've examined, I've started to do this here. I see Brexit eco-criticism and archipelagic theory as overlapping. I'm hoping to develop this by looking in more detail at women's nature writing from each of the devolved nations of the UK. An archipelagic approach to place-based writing can invert traditional dualities of centres and margins and challenge cultural dominance of the perceived centre. Ideas of the archipelagic can facilitate forms of writing that help us imaginatively transcend national boundaries, deconstruct concepts of nationhood, and consider the ways in which we connect ecologically, culturally, and linguistically across geographical and political divides. Thank you very much for listening.